Armchair discussion. We have Prerna Soni, the Vice President for Invest India, which is the national investment promotion agency for the country. As Vice President, Prerna leads the Financial Investors Initiative for Infrastructure, Real Estate, and Energy. And her focus has been on attracting institutional investors such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and private equity to invest in India. Paul Lam is the Strategy and Policy Officer for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Paul is responsible for executing the digital infrastructure strategy and the thematic priorities of technology-enabled infrastructure for the AIIB. So it's great to have you both. Thank you for joining this discussion. So Prerna, we'll start with you actually with the first question. So Infratech has been a really important part of your work. And I guess we can say that in your case, finance going into Infratech has come about from the demand to finance infrastructure more broadly in India. So how much has been invested into Infratech related projects? I mean, obviously the ones that Invest India has been involved in. And why is Infotech so important to the development delivery of infrastructure in the country?
Thank you so much, Monica. So I want to put it in perspective in an Indian scenario and then sort of address your question from there. If I talk about the infrastructure development that we need in India, we're looking at $1.4 trillion in the next 5 years. We launched something called the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is all greenfield and brownfield projects that we need to complete in the country in the next 5 years. Just again to put it in a little bit more perspective, in an emerging market, the logistics cost, especially in India, it's somewhere between 14 to 16% of our GDP. For a developed nation, it actually is somewhere between 8 to 10%. Our mandate as a country and our ambition is with this large-scale infrastructure development that we're doing in a country like India, that logistics cost has to be brought down. Now, when we're talking about the scale of cost of the new infrastructure that has to be developed and the existing infrastructure that we have, one of the key areas which is going to lead to this reduction in logistics cost will come from efficiencies of infrastructure usage and operations. And that is exactly where Infratech comes into place. If I talk about only renewable energy in a country like India, very recently we announced that of all of our energy, more than 40% is going to come from renewable sources. We have given ourselves a target of 500 gigawatts to be added in the renewable energy space to the entire grid. Now, to give you a little perspective about India, in 2014, we had around 18,000 villages which had never got electricity. We've got all of them added to the grid. So there's electricity, 100% electrification that has happened in India. But what we are now trying to do is 100% electrification of each and every household. When we do that and we're looking at that mix of urban and rural, what becomes very important is technology, wherein you do retrofitment of, for example, you do retrofitment of existing meters to make them smart meters. This is very important to reduce the wastage and identify areas of wastage in electricity. We're looking at startups in India in the Infratech space who are looking to map energy distribution all across the country, again, with the idea of identifying areas of wastage. Very interestingly, one more fact that I'd like to put in here is that of smart cities. You were speaking about how much of the emissions coming from buildings and transport infrastructure. In a country like India, we actually have 30 people moving from a village to a city per minute, which means we will have 863 million people in our cities by 2025. Now, of course, we don't have the wherewithal to manage as many people, so we're building additional 100 cities. These are, of course, going to be smart cities, and we're looking at sustainable models to be able to make them smart enough for the kind of population we have. And the solution there again comes in from technology to be able to make sure that there is a sustainable development of infrastructure across all these cities. So, just to conclude, I'd like to say Infratech is the way forward to make all of this large infrastructure that we're developing across the world, and especially EMs more and more efficient. And this brings about a new paradigm shift in how investments and operations are done in infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Prerna, for sharing that context. And a little bit later on, we'll talk a little bit more about your approach, to actually facilitating, that whole sort of ecosystem and technology implementation and financing.
So I think we lost Monica.
Yeah, I can't hear Monica. Paul, would you want to give your perspective by the time she joins in?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Maybe I'll just try to answer similar questions and share a couple of perspectives from my side. I think you have heard from Sridhani Alexander, like why Aiib cares so much about Infratech and why Infratech is so important to every one of us. So Aiib approved the technology-enabled infrastructure thematic priority in 2020, and it really involves using technology to deliver benefits. But to make this happen, we need both development and applications. And that's exactly why Aiib, on one hand, finance investments in projects with significant technology capital expenditures, but we also invest in the tech companies and funds that provide key developments of those core technologies like AI, electrical vehicles, and etc. To just share a couple of experiences that we had, we done a couple of projects in 2021. One example is that we invested into a leading AI fund where we not only invest into the funds, but we also work with the fund manager and the consulting arms associated to research and to figure out what are the new AI technologies that are readily usable and could be applied to improve efficiencies of infrastructure projects. But on the other hand, we also look into financing infrastructure projects which can demonstrate as well as showcasing the importance of technology improvements. We financed one road construction greenfield project connecting Vietnam and Guangxi, where we facilitated the uses of the BIM and digital twin. And throughout this process, I can tell you a lot of challenges that you probably have to go through, which are non-technological, but more about how do you design the right incentives for the procurement? How do you think about procurement for outcomes and so on and so forth? And throughout all these examples, maybe I'll just close my answers with a couple of thoughts of the challenges. And maybe when Monica comes back, we can look at what are the ways to overcome these. The challenges are quite different depending on which side you're looking at. On the application side, basically you're the buyer and you're financing an infrastructure and you want to apply these technologies. The lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness, the restrictive procurement, which focuses more on the ways that you do it rather than the outcomes, and the dislocation of interests are really challenging. Let me give you a very quick example. It's very hard to persuade the economic buyers to spend CapEx today to save OpEx in the future. It may sound weird, but this dislocation of interest does happen, especially in the public financing. But it also happened in the private financing because when most of the investors invest into an infrastructure project, they treat it as a fixed income type alternative assets that yield cash. And they don't necessarily think about an infrastructure asset as they manage their private equity portfolios, thinking about growth and prospects. But on the other hand, for the development sides, the picture is not so easy neither. You could imagine in Silicon Valley or in Beijing or any technology companies, it will probably be a very hard sell to them to deploy their best technology geeks and developers and investors in the VC world to look at infrastructure sectors, because the opportunity cost for them is just so high, because you could easily use the same piece of technologies and the risk capital to invest into things which are lower hanging fruits in either fintech, media, crypto, blockchain, so on and so forth. And there is just not a very natural reasons for them to organically look at these sectors in the first place. And it's very, very difficult. So I think I would just end it up with these two challenges that I have observed. But since we have done the deals, I'm quite confidently to say that there is a way to come over it. Back to you, Monica.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And it's rather ironic that we're talking about technology, and technology is just not working for us today, so, at least for me. No, fantastic. And I mean, we've obviously had a chat. I caught like halfway into your presentation, but from our previous chats around this, talking about some of those capabilities and being able to deliver technology at scale and realize the benefits, as well as the ecosystem and the complexities around that, I think are key points. So I guess now that we've kind of talked about some of that context, I might go back to you again, Prerna, in terms of telling us a little bit more about your approach to attracting the financing needed for Infratech. I know that you make use of a lot of partnerships. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and can you also share some case studies with us?
Certainly. Thank you so much. I think one of the aspects as Invest India that we've been focusing on, is getting institutional investments into infrastructure. There are, of course, two aspects to it. One aspect is all the money that is coming in into operational assets in the country, and that's where I go back to the point of efficiency increasing. The other aspect is all the greenfield infrastructure that as a country we're building. And our focus as Invest India, when we work with a lot of these infrastructure investors, is to help them partner with tech players within the country and internationally. We, in fact, have a program called Acceleration of Innovation, wherein we help, identify grassroots innovations which can help across sectors, including infrastructure, and sort of help them partner. And from the perspective of investors, what becomes really important, to put it in perspective of alpha generation, whenever any institutional investor is looking to invest in any country, especially when it comes to emerging markets and they do their risk return analysis, for them, risks are higher in emerging markets, and they need to have a significant amount of returns to potentially match up with these risks. And one of the areas where we see a lot of these investors generating alpha in India are the efficiencies that they bring in. To give you an example, I Squared Capital is a GP which has been investing. It's a fund manager investing in infrastructure across South America and India. They have a portfolio company called Cube Highways in India, which has been managing quite a few roads, and they actually built in efficiencies into their roads by bringing in technologies. These techs would be to identify, for example, one of the roads that they're currently managing has a lot of freight movement on one side and trucks coming in empty on the other side, because of which roads on one side of the entire area had started depressing a little bit. So they started using technologies to identify what are the best ways to continue to use the existing roads without the need for capacity augmentation. And we understand they were able to generate more than 4% additional returns just by using tech. These are the kind of examples that we see across a lot of infrastructure investors in India, wherein they are bringing in the aspects of tech. And one thing that I'd like to add on is also the kind of things that the government of India is doing. So, for example, one concern that we've seen in a lot of emerging markets is that you would have infrastructure development on a need basis. For example, if you need to have a road construction done, you would only go ahead and acquire road you would acquire land only as much as needed for road construction. Today, we're sitting in a place where tech is being used by the state governments of India, the central government of India, with the perspective of actually integrating the entire infrastructure planning as well on day one, to make sure that all acquisitions all roads, all environment clearance, everything is done in advance for the entire infrastructure development with the view of reducing costs in the future. And that's where a lot of InfraTech companies are actually bringing in their capabilities, even for the government of India, to make sure that there is potential for alpha generation for governments as well.
Excellent. It's great to see that kind of progress, and that they do have that kind of foresight in terms of that efficiency aspect as well. And Paul, how about you? So how is the AIIB addressing the challenges that you spoke about before? And can you share any case studies with us also?
Sure. I'll just break my answer into three parts: the general approach, a couple of case studies, and maybe a couple of learnings. The general approach is that we need to recognize the applications and the development of technology problem itself is not a technology problem. It's a problem of convincing, removing stigma, communicating the benefits better, bridging the perception gaps, and better incentivize. So all of these issues means we need an ecosystem. So for us to finance this, whether it's on the application side or whether it's on the development side, we need to create a total ecosystem. And the best total ecosystem in technology, we have seen it. Silicon Valley, Boston, Beijing, London for fintech. So there are actually some precedents to show us what is the way to do technology finance and how do we create a practical applications and an ecosystem for people to get on. That's the general approach. So what is the specific things that we would need to do? What AIIB takes as an approach is we build an AIIB InfraTech platform, which is an umbrella that brings together three things: investments, connections between stakeholders building a community, and finally, knowledge facilitation. To give you a case study, maybe two, we invested into Lightsmith Climate Resilience Partner, which focuses on using data analytics to help infrastructure sectors from energy to transport mitigate some of the climate adaptation risks. In order to do that investment, you not only need to find the investment prospects, but you also need to have the ability to articulate your taxonomy properly, because the problem that you are solving is a systematic problem. It's very complex. So we do need to have a right taxonomy so that the investors can actually strategize their investment thesis appropriately before they could actually map out the investment universe and finding the right investments. And also with the taxonomy, that will allow them to help the portfolio companies mapping the business development opportunities and applying those technologies to the government sponsors and to the infrastructure sponsors. If you don't have the taxonomy, I would almost like compare it to 10 years ago. If we didn't have the terminology of fintech, that we have to go to every investment bank and go to every government and explain to them, hey, this is a mobile wallet, which you can do this and this and that. People lose interest and people cannot understand what it is. So the importance of that terminology building is instrumental. And I argue the same for Infotech. The second example I would use is one of the reasons investments that we have committed ourselves to investing into an AI fund. And in this AI fund, they may not have immediately applications and investment prospects into AI applications into infrastructure. But what we do is we do see there is a potential for these AI companies to infuse their technologies into energy sectors. So what we do is we invest into the fund and we work with the partners as well as the company to do a couple of innovation events, cross-matching the portfolio companies as well as the investment partners with the infrastructure sponsors that we have within our AIB portfolio. That co-development and co-innovations would help us to think about what are the future opportunities that we can apply AI. So with that, I'll just close with one maybe learning from these two case studies. It's really important that we take the ecosystem view. Most of the time, investors will think about, hey, I'm just an investment. I'm just a financier. So give me a project, I'll sign the check. That doesn't work. in technology, and it has never worked that way. If you look into Silicon Valley, if you look in Beijing, or any innovation ecosystem for financiers in technology, they are hands-on. So the point I want to make here is we really need to get into this growth mindset, and we have to roll our sleeves up. The way that we worked before, that we're just financiers, we're just investors, we'll just sign check, as long as you have the EPC contractor, the so-called turnkey, and then we'll just sit back, wouldn't work. And it wouldn't work before and wouldn't work in the future. So one of the learnings here that I really want to highlight is, as an investor, if we want to mobilize financing into Infratech, we have to roll our sleeves up. We have to take the first principle on everything. And it's important that we're not just putting money and mobilizing financing, but while we mobilize the finance, we couple it with good ideas, facilitation of a community, and generate knowledge.